Well, it's very difficult. I mean, if you live in in Kabul, in and around Kabul, in the northern areas, it's probably easier for you to vote. But in the southern areas, in particular, the Pashtun-dominated regions, where the Taliban is the strongest and where the fundamentalist influence is the strongest, women have essentially been told they cannot vote. And what's happened is that thousands of women have been registered to vote by their husbands or by male relatives, and voting has apparently been done in their name, which means that votes have been cast for, in fact, there have been some provinces where there have been 30% more votes, voter registration for women than even for men. That means votes have been cast for women without women's control over them. There have been instances of men taking home registration books to get, apparently, the fingerprints of women, although who's able to check that is questionable. And so women have been used once more to justify, to legitimize the power play among men. And, you know, all of this talk about liberation of women, what does it all mean when you have the new law that legalized the rape of Shia women that was quietly passed by Karzai in July? When you have women parliamentarians being kicked out of office, what does it mean for women to participate in a democracy when that very supposed democracy completely acts against them and, in fact, institutionalizes their oppression? And we're supposedly protecting, through the U.S. and NATO occupation, this liberation of women. The only people who have actually been liberated in Afghanistan are warlords.
And on this issue of the health of women, Oxfam coming out, this is a report, 1 in 3 Afghans are at risk of hunger, that a pregnant Afghan woman dies an average of every 30 minutes in Afghanistan?
You know, these indicators have, shocked the world before 9/11. And somehow they don't shock us anymore because we assume that they have changed. Even before the fall of the Taliban, indicators like maternal mortality, infant mortality, women's literacy, employment, etc., were among the worst in the world. There's one province in Afghanistan where the highest maternal mortality rates are seen. 65 out of 100,000 births doesn't have, the woman doesn't survive that birth. That's the highest ever seen in the world. That hasn't changed over the last 8 years. The Oxfam report exposes that those indicators, which is where it really matters, right? Does it, what matters more, being able to cast a vote or serve in parliament, or simply being able to live through childbirth? Even the basic human needs, particularly of women, haven't been met. And that is the greatest indication of how women have been completely sidelined. They are used when it is convenient for occupations, for foreign occupations, even for the warlords in government, and even for the Taliban. But when it actually comes to women's real well-being, women are shunted aside. And we should be just as shocked now as we were before 9/11.
And Sonali, the Obama administration has obviously increased the military presence and the aggressiveness of U.S. troops throughout the country. There were large operations in July in Helmand province. What do you think has been the impact of this increased U.S. Fighting power in the country on the elections?
Well, the U.S. and NATO realized that it would seem a little bit odd to continue their war-fighting operations on the day of the election. So they announced with much fanfare that they were actually going to be setting aside the war-fighting and turning out their forces to protect polling places and to boost the election safety. But what we've been doing before that, especially in July, as you mentioned, under the Obama administration, 4,000 extra troops were authorized to enter the Helmand province, where the Taliban gets the majority of its opium that funds its insurgency. And the idea is to get in there and to chase out the Taliban or capture them and to supposedly, quote, clear and hold those areas. But what the U.S. has done is it simply spread the insurgency into other parts of the country. Also, a huge resentment has been built up over the past 8 years against the U.S. for the thousands of civilians we've killed. Obama cannot expect that that resentment will simply vaporize because now we've apparently changed our policy from relying more on ground troops versus airstrikes. All we've done is provide fodder for a very angry, and rightly so angry, people. And predictably, the U.S. saw the largest number of U.S. casualties in the month of July because we put extra ground troops on the ground after having killed so many Afghans. Afghans fought back, some through the Taliban, some alongside the Taliban, and of course the Taliban themselves. And the more troops that Obama puts on the ground, the more troops we're going to lose, and the more Afghans are going to be killed. This year alone, just in the first 6 to 8 months of this year, 50% more U.S. troops were killed in Afghanistan than last year. 20% more Afghan civilians were killed than last year. And so as you ramp up the occupation, you ramp up the killings on both sides.
Sonali Kolhatkar, we want to thank you very much for being with us, host of Uprising on Pacifica radio station KPFK in Los Angeles, co-author of the book Bleeding Afghanistan. And that does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Berkshire, Sarah Mata, Angeli Comet, Steve Martinez, Nicole Salazar, Hani Masood, Robbie Karen. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez for another edition of Democracy Now!